You're on. Thank you very much.
Okay, now I'll get rid of continue. Okay, well, Bernard, thank you very much for this invitation. It's a terrific honour for me and a pleasure for me to take part in your lecture series, and an honour and a delight to have my old friend Dan Sulmasy as the respondent in this discussion. Bernard, what I'm going to do is to address the right to religious freedom, and my organising question is it a threat to equality or an aspect of equality? And the way I'm going to structure this little talk is that I'll introduce it by describing 3 recent events. I will then explain how the matter of the right to religious freedom was recently discussed in an Australian inquiry. And then I'll go on to 2 of the philosophically controversial issues which bedevil this debate. And I'll finish by saying a few things by way of conclusion and returning to those 3 events. So in the middle of last year, shortly after the US Supreme Court found that key provisions of the Civil Rights Act of '64, which outlaws workplace discrimination on the basis of sex, should be interpreted to include sexual preference and orientation as well, the ACLU sued the University of Maryland's medical system and its affiliate hospital, St. Joseph's, for cancelling, with a week's notice, a hysterectomy for gender-affirming purposes that had been scheduled as part of what a doctor described as a medically necessary treatment for gender dysphoria. When the hospital pointed out that it abides by the ethical and religious directives for Catholic healthcare services, according to which Catholic hospitals do not perform procedures that induce sterility or loss of fertility unless their direct effect is the cure or alleviation of a present and serious pathology, and a simpler treatment is not available, and that doctors seeking privileges at the hospital agreed to abide by these directives prior to being granted operating privileges, the question arises as to whether this ought to be thought of as raising the debate about freedom of religion, and if so, about its legitimate scope and limits. The same challenge faces Australian Catholic private hospitals now, and will soon confront our great Catholic public hospitals. The question of religious freedom has been a matter of lively discussion here. In September 15, in the context of a debate about a proposed change to the definition of marriage in Australian law from the union of a man and a woman to the union of 2 people, the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference authorised the publication of a pastoral letter entitled "Don't Mess with Marriage." The bishops said, "We wish to engage with this debate, to present the Church's teaching to the faithful, and to explain the position of the Catholic faithful to the wider community." The Catholic Archbishop of Hobart arranged for the letter to be sent to Catholic schools. Subsequently, a complaint was made on the ground that the publication breached Tasmania's Anti-Discrimination Act, which makes it illegal to offend, humiliate, intimidate, insult, or ridicule another person, or humiliate or offend an individual or group on the basis of a protected characteristic, including gender or sexuality, and that the words "messing with marriage is messing with kids" insinuated that gay and transgender people were intent on interfering with children. The complaint went to 2 conciliation hearings before being withdrawn. And then in 2018, Israel Folau, a rugby player of Tongan background and international fame, an active member of the Assemblies of God, was asked by a follower on Instagram what was God's plan for homosexuals. He replied, "Hell, unless they repent of their sins and turn to God." Rugby Australia resisted calls to sanction him. However, in the Followingly, in the context of Tasmania's passing of amendments to its Birth, Deaths and Marriages Registration Act, which allow gender to be changed on birth certificates by a simple stat dec, Folau posted a screenshot on Instagram quoting 1 Corinthians 6, 9-10. Warning, drunks, homosexuals, adulterers, liars, fornicators, thieves, atheists, idolaters, hell awaits you. Repent, only Jesus saves. On this occasion, Folau was found to have breached Rugby's code of conduct and his employment was terminated. He sued for breach of conduct and restraint of trade. Subsequently, a confidential settlement was reached and he left Australia to play for the Catalan Dragons. These 3 cases about the right to religious freedom raise serious questions about that right. In what follows, I consider how the matter has been discussed recently in Australia. I mention 2 controversial questions which bedevil the issue and suggest how they should be resolved. And I finish by coming back to the cases. One very important preliminary. Though I will advert to legal discussions of the matter, mine is not a legal analysis. I'm not competent to do that, even with respect to Australian statutes and judge-made laws, let alone with respect to foreign statutes and judge-made laws. So the recent Australian inquiry. In November 17, in the context of that parliamentary debate, the adequacy of protections for religious bodies that maintain that marriage can only be between a man and a woman became controversial. So the then Prime Minister appointed an expert panel to examine whether Australian law adequately protects the right to religious freedom. The panel's report began by setting out precisely what the right entails, the source of the right, its substantive content and limits, and the relationship between this and other rights. The most important international instrument in which it's described, it said, is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Article 18 says, everyone shall have the right to freedom of thought, conscience and religion. This right shall include freedom to have or to adopt a religion or belief of his choice, and freedom either individually or in community with others, in public or in private, to manifest his religion or belief in worship, observance, practice and teaching. No one shall be subject to coercion which would impair his freedom to have or adopt a belief of his choice. Freedom to manifest that religion or belief may be subject only to such limitations as are prescribed by law and are necessary to protect public safety, order, health or morals, or the fundamental rights and freedoms of others. And the parties to this covenant undertake to have respect for the liberty of parents to ensure that religious and moral education of their children conforms to their own convictions. So, as set out in that article and in other articles, the right has got 5 components: freedom of thought, conscience or religion, including freedom from coercion, freedom to manifest one's religion, the liberty of parents to ensure the moral and religious education of their kids, freedom, discrimination in employment of the right, and the obligation to prohibit religious vilification. The report then highlighted some key features of this right. Very important, that freedom of thought is broadly construed to protect theistic, non-theistic and atheistic beliefs, as well as the right to profess any religion or belief. That it bars coercion to compel adherence to religion, coercion to compel recantation of a religion, that it includes the negative right not to be pressured to participate in a religious practice, and that it does not include the right not to have one's religion disparaged. That freedom to manifest one's religion has a communal dimension, even though it's a right held by individuals, that it protects worship, observance, practice and teaching, and these include freedom to choose religious leaders and teachers, to establish schools, to prepare religious texts and publications. But again, any manifestation is subject to those limitations already mentioned. and that freedom from discrimination in the enjoyment of this right is an aspect of the right to equality and non-discrimination, that the right is mutually supportive of a range of other rights which are collectively essential to the proper functioning of a democracy such as Australia's. So then what the panel did was to have a look at Australia's domestic legal framework and see how adequate it was to protect that right. It noticed three things. Section 116 of our Constitution provides that the Commonwealth should not make any law for establishing any religion or for imposing religious observance or prohibiting the free exercise of religion, and there'll be no religious test for qualification for any office. However, it pointed out, as a protection of religious freedom, that limits the powers of the Commonwealth, but not of the states. It does not create a positive right for individuals to hold or manifest their faith, and it does not create an obligation on the Commonwealth to do anything to ensure freedom of religion. Then there are some provisions in our state laws which protect aspects of religious freedom by way of exemptions to discrimination laws, and some state laws are required to be shown to be compatible with the Charter of Human Rights, including freedom of thought, conscience, and religion and belief. However, the exceptions for religious bodies are limited, they vary from state to state, and any requirement that laws be compatible with human rights, in fact, has no legal effect. And then finally, there's our common law tradition, which we inherit from England, which comprises unwritten rights and freedoms, and it provides some sound principles of interpretation. However, as the report noted, this means little more than that in cases of ambiguity, courts will favour an interpretation consistent with Australia's international obligations. So then the panel considered a range of proposals to improve things, from the extravagant to the modest. It rejected the extravagant, and its three modest recommendations are striking in that the first two actually narrow the scope of existing protections of religious freedoms. So it recommended the elimination of a provision in the Commonwealth's Sex Discrimination Act, which allows religious institutions to discriminate against students on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, marital or religious status or pregnancy, provided that they discriminate, quote, in good faith in order to avoid injury to the religious susceptibility of adherents of that religion or creed. But the panel said the law should not provide that kind of protection, even though it noted it did not hear of a single instance of a faith-based school actually relying on that protection. Secondly, the panel recommended the tightening up, that is the limiting, of some existing provisions in Australian law. States which permit, by way of exception to anti-discrimination prohibitions, discrimination by schools in employment on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, or relationship status, should have that permission limited to the following circumstances: that the discrimination is founded in the precepts of the religion, that the school has a publicly available policy outlining its position in relation to the matter and explaining how the policy would be enforced, and that the school provides a copy of the policy in writing to employees and contractors. As one member of the panel later said, just as political parties create their own political environment by employing staff and attracting volunteers who share their outlook and want to publicise, proclaim and live by it, so religious schools should be able to create their own faith environment. And finally, noting a striking omission in the existing approach to the protection of human rights by even the prestigious Australian Human Rights Commission, the panel recommended the recognition of the right as a standalone human right on a par with other rights, in the light of which discrimination on the basis of a person's religion, as with any other inherent characteristics such as sex, age, disability or race, would be unlawful. Well, on receiving this report, the Commonwealth issued an exposure draft of a religious discrimination bill, which went a little bit further than the panel had recommended. This received a mixed reception. Some said, look, it's just common sense. Some thought it went too far and privileged the already privileged position of religious institutions in Australia, and others thought that it didn't go far enough. A dozen or so protections were added, and a second draft was then released. This changed what one member of the panel called a lean, clean religious discrimination bill into a religious discrimination plus bells and whistles bill. Then COVID-19 hit, and there the matter lies at the federal level in Australia. So I come now to the second part of this little talk. The right to religious freedom raises important as well as difficult questions. The view one takes about several questions will inform the way one thinks about the significance of this freedom, as well as its legitimate scope and limits, as they're tested in particular cases. I'll mention two questions. The first concerns how one understands religious belief itself. Is religious belief to be contrasted with rational inquiry? Are its claims, including its social, moral, and political claims, to be conceived as outside the domain of rational assessment? Is it no more than a private aspect of self-determination, an expression of an individual's deep concerns? Or should it be treated as grounded in rational inquiry within the full scope of disciplined reasoning, an inquiry in which various forms of theism, together with various forms of atheism and agnosticism, are all open to rational assessment? Well, my own view is that we should understand religious belief, and here I'm thinking in particular about the three monotheisms of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, as being within the scope of reasoned assessment. As my fellow Australian Mark Johnson has pointed out, to rely on a purely subjective basis for answering the question, do you believe in God? Shows that one has not understood the question and so does not understand just what it means to believe in, or for that matter, to disbelieve in God. Of course, believing in God is not reducible to believing the truth of the proposition that God exists. But nor is believing in God, in the sense of trusting in God, a purely subjective phenomenon, one which the individual discovers by looking inwards. Whether the God, small g, whether the God I believe in really is God, capital G, whether the God I believe in really is God, if such a being exists, is an objective question that transcends what is settled by my psychological state, my introspectable state of belief. Believing in God includes an objective achievement of hitting the mark. So, for that matter, does atheism. Both properly understood involve reasoned reflection. Johnson's explanation of the origins of the confused syncretism, which identifies Yahweh with the Trinity and with Allah, is relevant to our discussion. He thinks it originates in a kind of wishful thinking. I want to respect others. I want, therefore, to respect their deeply held beliefs. So I jump mistakenly to the belief that we all worship the same God. Were I to abandon that belief, which I should, because it's manifestly not the case, then I would have to face the harder question. Do I really believe in God? Capital G. As indeed would a careful atheist, for he would be faced by the question, do I really disbelieve in God? Capital G. This goes to show, I think, that we should understand religious belief and its corollaries in atheism and agnosticism as matters apt for reasoned reflection. Why does this matter? Well, one fails to understand the nature of theological belief if one treats it as an entirely subjective phenomenon, and to treat the claims of religion about human beings and human societies, including its claims about what laws and public policies to adopt, as outside the scope of reason, fosters the idea that the proper starting point of political philosophy is atheism or agnosticism, and that sidelines religion's moral and political contributions. It also devalues the respect for the capacity to reason about, as Aristotle says, both ends and means, which marks human beings out from the rest of the animal world. And in addition, if religious belief is taken to be outside the domain of reason, merely an aspect of self-determination, then resolving political debates about the proper scope and limits of this right risk becoming intractable. A second question concerns how to understand the right itself. Is it to be understood as a liberty, for instance, the liberty to, quote, define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life? Or is it to be understood as an immunity from coercion in respect of religious belief and expression? Dworkin claims that the liberty view is the basis of the US First Amendment's guarantee of religious freedom. Finnis claims that the immunity from coercion view is found not only in the guarantee of the European Convention on Human Rights, that everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, not only in the Second Vatican Council's Declaration on Religious Liberty, but also in the First Amendment's protection of the free exercise of religion. We should, I think, understand the right to religious freedom as an immunity from coercion by the state or by religious authorities, coercion with respect to religious belief and with the expressions of religious belief that are compatible with laws which uphold a just public order. This, I think, provides the right starting point, for it supplies an objective test that can be applied in particular cases, about which, of course, reasonable people can still disagree. Some cases will be easier than others. A state school in England bans some of its students from wearing to school religious garments required by some militant forms of a religion which endorse the idea that anyone who speaks adversely of its prophet or declines specific invitations to convert may appropriately be intimidated, assaulted, or even killed. Did the school breach the students' immunity from coercion? And what about the duty not to coerce? Does the duty not to coerce include government actions whose intentions are not to coerce anyone, but to favour some, so that a coercive effect is a side effect? But they're not easy questions, and good people will disagree. But if the right is taken as a liberty, then I think it risks being undermined by just the kinds of questions which arise if one adopts Rawls' rank rights lexically approach. Even if agreement could be found on what the ordering of rights ought to be, that exercise is likely to reflect contemporary social mores according to which a right to religious freedom is seen more often as a threat to the plurality of a liberal society rather than an expression of it. Well, why does this one matter? First, because a conception of religious freedom as a liberty, I think, undermines the very good of self-determination that it seeks to respect. Second, because a conception of religious freedom as freedom from coercion illuminates something very important about religious education, that parents and teachers ought not coercively impose a set of belief on children. Third, because coercion for the sake of religion has the very bad consequence of ruining people's understanding of the object of the inquiry, and because a conception of religious freedom as a freedom from unjust coercion counterbalances a hostile secularist devaluation of the earnest search for truth. Not all secularist forms of secularism are so hostile, but some are. And so I come to my conclusion. We people of faith should profess our own beliefs reasonably and respectfully. We should respect others, recognizing that this involves respecting the fact that they're likely to have their own deeply held religious beliefs, whether theistic, atheistic, or even agnostic. But respecting others can coexist with not affirming their beliefs. A Catholic Christian does that when she respects the entitlement of a Jehovah's Witness to refuse a blood transfusion. In addition, people of faith should strive to find common ground with people of other faiths and of none, particularly in the midst of the great challenges that face us in pluralist, often divided societies. And we should recognise that not every case of differential treatment involves discrimination in the sense of unjustly discriminating against another person. Once, 3 of us were studying philosophy of education and we undertook the same exam. Bill and I had just 2 hours. Joan had 3 hours. Joan had had a stroke the year before and sharp of mind was slow of hand. And we should avoid trying to protect religious freedom by the method of exceptions and exemptions to anti-discrimination laws. In addition to being illogical, it sends the message that religious folk are moral inferiors who just can't come up to the mark in the give and take involved in any political debate, who want to inflict discriminatory harm on others, as one commentator recently put it. As for the Archbishop of Hobart, religious leaders ought to be free to explain in the public square their religious tradition's reason for teaching a view of the nature of marriage. As one member of the panel subsequently said, religious schools, including schools which serve affluent communities, ought to be free to teach that it is harder for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven than for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle. Indeed, it is the mark of a reasonable religion not only that it holds out its social teachings as matters apt for rational assessment, but also that it is ready to shoulder the argumentative burden of making them plausible in the public square. If the Israel Folau matter is thought of a clash between 2 liberty rights, then in today's often religiously hostile secularity in Australia, a court could hardly be relied upon to do anything other than treat Folau's freedom of religion as a threat to social equality. I think his tweets were regrettable. His religious beliefs were not expressed reasonably and respectfully. They embody mistaken views of what Christianity teaches with respect to homosexuality and all those other things, and they thus bring Christianity into disrepute. That said, what he said fell well within the scope of the right to religious freedom as found in Article 18 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And as for St. Joseph's Hospital, is this a matter of religious freedom? That depends on whether you take Catholic beliefs to be limited to certain specific claims about the existence and nature of God, or to include wider claims about human anthropology, human flourishing, the common good. A critical thing here is that those wider social, ethical, and political claims are held to be matters of public reason. So a central question will be whether a pluralist society should leave room for individuals and indeed institutions to act on different views about what constitutes the nature of medical treatment, the purposes of medical treatment, and whether the society may legitimately use the means available to it, including the public purse, to impose one view of the matter on everyone and every institution. Some Australians thought that it was a pity that discussion of the right to religious liberty arose in the context of a debate about the extension of the right to marry to LGBTI people. This, they said, had led some commentators to treat the question as a threat to diversity rather than an aspect of it. Thus, my organising question: is the right to religious freedom a threat to equality or an aspect of equality? True, the matter is complicated by the complexities involved in the discussion of human equality. Two views of equality were and still are at work in the Australian debate. On one view, recognition of human equality entails an entitlement to equality of esteem. Thus, the talk of status harms and of the need to outlaw offensive speech, etc. On another, recognition of human equality is nothing other than the recognition of the natural kind to which human beings belong, the kind for whom, as Socrates put it, the unexamined life is not worth living. Thus, the importance of treating religious beliefs, theistic, atheistic, agnostic, as attempts to examine life. That raises questions about whether all ways of life are equally compatible with individual flourishing and the common good of a society. But here, in the middle of things, I shall stop.
Great. Well, thank you very, very much for that really wonderful talk, Bernadette. It's delightful to hear you and see you, even if it's by video. I think we're all enlightened by your words. I thank Bernard as well for bringing us, all of us, together, and for his kind words of introduction. I'm going to share my screen, if that works, and try to show a few slides here. And yes, hopefully that's working. Let me do that. Good. Okay, so I'd like to respond particularly to Bernadette's last part of her talk in terms of the questions that she asked, which I think are important ones about how we understand religious belief and how we understand the right to religious belief, because I think those are really the critical questions in her analysis. Overall, I thought, and I'm sure everyone agrees, that these were very important test cases, the three that she brought, she was very successful, I think, in her talk in helping us understand how, even though many of us are coming at this question from the perspective of bioethics, that the problem is wider than bioethics. Her analysis was quite insightful. And I don't really have a lot of disagreement, Bernadette, but maybe I'd call them 3 points of amplification or different takes on some of the points that you raised that I hope will further discussion between us and then with the audience as well. One point where I come maybe close to disagreeing is your question about worshiping the same God. I agree that this is often fuzzy language, and I think it does matter, as you pointed out, whether Jesus is the Son of God or whether Muhammad was the last prophet sent by God. And in this sense, all religions are not the same, and all of our conceptions of God are not the same. And I wonder if we might not talk in a way in which we distinguish ontological from epistemological questions in addressing this. And I'd suggest that I can believe that there is one God who is triune in nature as an ontological claim, yet still hold that others know this God but are also partly mistaken epistemologically in their understanding of this one God's nature. Because if you're right and I'm right that there is one God, then if somebody else claims that there is a God, they're at least moving in the right direction. And we might say that they may be a little off center from our perspective in how they understand that God. And I offer this because I think it might form a fairly effective basis for interfaith dialogue and action, where it's not simply that your God is not my God, but that we have different understandings of who God is, and disagree about the nature of God. But that might form an effective basis for both interfaith dialogue and then collective action about particular issues like this one, which face all peoples of all faith. So just a question to raise there about the proper way to think about that. I agree wholeheartedly with you that part of the problem that we face is a really uninformed conception of religion. I think you are right that far too many people have the view, particularly non-religious people, that it is purely subjective. I think you have shown us, following Finis, that the religious belief is subjected to reason and justification. But one aspect that you hinted at in other parts of the talk, but maybe I want to name very specifically along with this, is the, I think, misconception of religion as a mere community of free association, like a political party. That is the way in which law and many secular societies and increasingly secular societies view religion. But it isn't like a political party or any other sort of free association, right? If one believes something that has an ultimate transcendent source of meaning, value, and relationship, identifies a being as the source of everything that exists, in a way that radically orients one's behavior towards everyone and everything, and may, in most cases, give directives that are not limited to private thoughts, worship, teaching, religious practices, and rituals, but affects how one lives in the world. We're talking about something that is extraordinarily different from checking off on my voter registration card whether I am a Democrat or a Republican. And I think that it's this sort of sense that we have to fit it into the category of some sort of community of free association that's part of the problem with the way in which current legal thinking has been pushing about religious freedom. And then I just want to offer that even if religion were not the issue at hand, it seems to me that the moral logic that one is encountering more and more of requiring all persons and institutions, religious or not, to accommodate the full spectrum of diversity of secular morality is suspect. Because the argument, particularly in healthcare, but in other settings as well, seems to be something like this. Individual A believes that doing X is morally wrong, whether that's for religious reasons or not. But A is going to be compelled, perhaps by law, to perform X for P, individual P, because P doesn't believe that X is wrong. And P is legally permitted to have X performed by members of Group D, and A is a member of Group D. Now, that's always a mouthful, and when philosophers start using letters and variables and placeholders, it gets confusing for people. That's part of why I use slides. But let's take the case where X is abortion. D is the medical profession, and A is a member of the medical profession, right? Dr. A believes abortion is morally wrong, but the push is to compel Dr. A to perform the abortion for P, because P doesn't believe that abortion is wrong, and patient P is legally permitted to have an abortion performed by members of the medical profession, and Dr. A is a member of the medical profession. So it pushes in that direction, and the only opt-out is to make an effect. Well, if you don't want to do it, at least you have to make an effective referral. But let's change some of the variables. What if X is female genital mutilation, D is the medical profession, A is a physician, and we are in a society where female genital mutilation is legal? If Dr. A believes that doing X is morally wrong, female genital mutilation, should Dr. A be compelled to perform female genital mutilation because that patient doesn't believe it's wrong and is legally permitted to have it, at least in this hypothetical society, performed by members of the medical profession, and Dr. A is a member of the medical profession? I don't think many people would think that that's a very tolerant society. X is pornography, and D is the filmmaking industry, and A is a movie director, right? So does movie director A believe that filming pornography is morally wrong? Should we be compelling director A to perform or to make a film that is pornographic for a client, P, because P doesn't believe that pornography is wrong, and P is legally permitted to have a pornographic film produced by members of the film industry, and director A is a member of the film industry. Or let's say X is a swastika tattoo. D is the tattoo industry, licensed by the government, at least in the United States, I suspect in Australia as well, and A is a tattoo artist. Does the tattoo artist get to be compelled to perform it simply because it is there's no law against doing that? It seems to me then that the real issue ethically might not be religion at all, at least in these kinds of cases, aside from the fact that religions are being singled out as dissenters from popular secular religious beliefs. The reason that a swastika tattoo or female genital mutilation doesn't get caught up into the discussions is that people will say, well, that's obviously wrong. It is not obvious to everyone that, for instance, abortion is morally permissible. Some people think that it is actually wrong and hold that view whether they're religious persons or not. Or maybe the real issue is tolerance for religion is only thought of as something that's be considered tolerance for a set of fuzzy, subjective, contrary thoughts that can't be permitted to affect practices outside of individual brains, private homes, and places of worship, which again goes back to your very important question about our conception of what a religion is and whether it is only something that affects our private acts and thoughts or something that affects the way we act in the world as a whole. So I will stop sharing and see if you've got comments or questions back to me, and then Bernard can open it up to the rest of the Q&A.
Well, first of all, Dan, thank you very much for such an attentive and kindly reading of my paper. That's I'm very grateful to you. On the first question that you drew our attention to, my suggesting that we shouldn't say we all worship the same God. And then your suggestion that we distinguish the ontological questions from the epistemological questions. I think that's a very helpful distinction. I remember that when I was at primary school, a Catholic primary school, and I should register my debt and my gratitude to the religious sisters who educated us at the primary school. I was sitting having lunch one day with a friend in the shelter shed. It must have been raining. And sister came by and she said, "Have you two said grace before meals?" And being the coward that I am, I probably lied and said I had. But my courageous friend said no. And sister said, "Oh," she said, I wouldn't eat without having said grace. I'd be too frightened of choking." I had a vague thought that there was an odd kind of being who'd make you choke if you don't say grace before meals. So generations, centuries later, when my daughter was at primary school, something came up about what you'd be asked when you arrived at the pearly gates. And the religious sister said to her, "Well, what I think he'll ask you is, and did you enjoy the good things I sent you?" And it struck me that these are two very different conceptions of God. And not both of them can be true. Not both of them are worthy of worship. So I really think it matters that we do what we can to foster, encourage the idea that when we're thinking about these things, we are engaged in rational reflection. I remember the very bright friend of my daughters when they were little sitting in the back of the car, and Alice said, "Oh, I don't believe in God." And I said, "Is this person you don't believe in, does he kind of have a long white beard and sit on a cloud?" And she said in effect, "Yes." And I said, "Oh, I don't think he's God." And she just looked at me being very bright and made it clear the conversation was over. So, Dan, I think that your suggestion for an interfaith basis, an effective basis for interfaith dialogue is a very good one, because of those three great monotheisms, it's certainly the case that each of them has at least some part of the truth about what's worthy of worship, if indeed anything is. Let's leave it open, the atheist move open. So I think that's a good suggestion of yours, and I take it on board. The second thing, Dan, is that religion isn't like a political party or any other free association. Yes, of course. The point that I didn't make clearly enough was that in Australian law, it's perfectly legal for a political party to advertise for someone to come and work for the party, making it clear that acceptance of the platform of that party is a necessary requirement. It's perfectly legal, and no one's troubled. I mean, basically because everyone can see it's common sense. So that was the analogy that I was trying to draw on for the sake of explaining something about the legitimacy of faith-based schools, making acceptance of, or maybe even something a little bit less than that, but ruling out active hostility to the central tenets of the religion a condition of employment. Now, there are complicated questions there. That's obviously much more important for a teacher of religion than it is for the gardener. But the gardener is an interesting case. So you're quite right. Religious adherence is much more important, much more, it affects everything about a person's life, much more important than connection with a political party or any other free association. And so, Dan, I think I'll leave it at that. I love the way you teach the last point. They're great examples. I mean to steal them and make them my own. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Largely, it seems like we're in heated agreement, which is not unexpected. Let me just clarify that on the second point, that I'm trying to suggest that you were so much making an analogy to a political party as part of your own argument, but rather that it seems to me that the way in which increasingly, at least in our country, religion is being treated as a matter of law is as if it were simply something that is limited to that very narrow set of that you described elsewhere in your paper of private thoughts, beliefs, worship, as long as it's inside a church and you own the ground that the church is on, and you're only teaching or taking care of people who are your co-religionists, as if religion had nothing to do with the way the rest of your life is lived outside of the church, so that it's treated as if it's just sort of a set of beliefs that a person has that can be protected, and you can write anything you want, you can think anything you want. We're not going to interfere with that, but don't take that out into the public square of ideas. Don't take that out into the hospital. Don't take that, in other cases in the United States, into the baking of wedding cakes, right? That this has nothing to do with the rest of the world. It can only be what happens in this very, very narrow private sphere. And that I take to be a deep misunderstanding of what religion actually is.
Thank you very much to both of you. That was a very rich paper and a rich exchange too. There are a number of questions. Some call simply for clarification or maybe amplification, to use Dan's word. And then there are a few challenges too. So let's go with clarification first, and then we'll move into more complicated matters. So Bernadette, would you just speak briefly to the question of what harm it does to consider what harm it does not to consider religious belief apt for rational assessment? So you did speak to the harm, but the question is for clarification on that claim.
Here's the harm that I think it does. It implies that human beings are less different from other animals than they are. I quoted the Socratic point, the unexamined life is not worth living. Now, we don't say that of other animals, but we recognize what he's saying of human beings. And if anything matters for examination by each of us, fallible human beings, getting the best grip we can on the transcendent, if such there is, that really matters. So not to treat religious belief as a matter of rational inquiry, undermines the very thing I think that it's meant to protect, that good of self-determination. Because the good of self-determination depends on my ability to reason about, as Aristotle says, ends and means, what's worth what really matters in life, what in truth matters. That's the harm. I don't know whether I'm succeeding in clarifying or just being as murky as I earlier was.
I'm going to say no, you're not being as murky, and I don't think you were murky to begin with. You did note too, though, that if you do not consider religious belief a matter of rational assessment, that somehow sidelines religion's social and political contributions. I think that the question might be asking you to say a little bit more about what you mean there.
Pretty well any discussion of a public kind in Australia, if you make a contribution, you will be, if I make a contribution, I'll be identified as a Catholic, it's pretty clear from my name. And a widespread immediate response will be, well, look, go away and stop trying to impose your own beliefs on others. So, questions of, our jurisdictions are increasingly legalising voluntary assisted suicide. It's very hard to make a contribution to that debate without your contribution being sidelined. And you're often just trying to point out something about the nature of medicine. Again, open to discussion, of course. And you're not trying to do anything, as it were, theological. But I am relying on, in the end, on the great social and ethical and political claims about individual flourishing and the common good that are embedded in the Catholic Christian tradition.
Thank you. Let me ask the one other question of clarification. You noted, I think somewhat in passing, that you do not favor yourself carving out exemptions and exceptions for religious believers. So the question is, well, how else is a pluralist society to leave room for these diverse practices, for refusing to go along with the practices that are legally sanctioned?
Well, the way that was suggested by this Ruddock report was the two extravagant suggestions it rejected was a federal Human Rights Act, a federal Commonwealth Freedom of Religion Act, and it rejected both of those, partly because it thought that they weren't achievable, but partly for in principle reasons. And what it recommended was an amendment to the Federal Discrimination Act to add a prohibition on discrimination on the basis of religion to all the other prohibitions. And so that's the way that's suggested. And it also added that this has been done in 5 of the 7 jurisdictions in Australia in their state acts, but there are 2 where it hasn't been done. So South Australia and New South Wales should both add that prohibition to the other prohibitions on discrimination on the basis of sex and age and disability and something or other else. So that's the way that is suggested. Now, so I'm not in favour of doing it as we now do it, because I think it's, well, as I say, illogical. And it just fosters the idea that people of faith are just incapable of being full-blooded members of the community. They want special things for themselves because they can't live up to civic standards that they should be able to live up to.
Thank you. Dan, would you come back, since there are some questions arising from your response and also your exchange with Bernadette? Some people understandably want to talk about some concrete examples. So let me go back here. So actually, this is directed to you, Dan, though, again, I think you both can speak to it. You used the example of someone refusing a swastika tattoo, but arguably, that's a direct attack on a group of people, while your other two examples, making a pornographic film and performing female genital mutilation, are something you believe to be wrong, but not an attack on others. So the suggestion is that example, the swastika tattoo, is somehow different from the others. I don't know if you want to speak to that. I hope I did justice to the question too.
Yeah, I guess that it might be different, but it might be the same in the sense that the person who's under the sort of way I set it up, the person who wants it might be someone who believes that it is good to emulate Hitler, something that I find reprehensible, right? So that's their belief. I don't think, as far as I know, it is actually illegal to have a tattoo of a swastika. It might be considered in some cases to be hate speech. Maybe the person would try to suggest that, well, I really want it as a Hindu symbol or something. But they are themselves asking for it, and you are capable of doing it, and you belong to a profession that's licensed to be able to do it. I think it falls under the same kind of category in that broad sense. Is it different in that it is, can be considered, hate speech towards another person that one is expressing in oneself? Perhaps one could consider the pornographic film to be misogynist in its own sense too, and not just something that is wrong for you to do, but to be saying something that's wrong about our conception of women. I'm simply giving a series of examples that would seem to fall under the kind of logic that is underlying the basic sense that if something is legally permitted, and even though you have a moral belief against it, you should be required to do it if someone asks for it and you're a member of a profession that is legally capable of doing so. May or may not be slightly different, but I think it falls into the general rubric.
What do you both think about the case of the baker? So much discussed case of the baker who does not want to make a wedding cake for a same-sex marriage. How does that figure here in your thinking? So if we were to use that as a concrete example, what do you both say about that case?
So
maybe
Dan,
I'll turn to someone from outside the country first. Yes, go ahead.
well, look, Dan, I need to be reminded of what in particular was the objection that cake maker.
Okay, so the case was, yes, the objection was that the cake maker was asked to make a wedding cake for a same-sex marriage. And he felt that doing so and putting the figures of two males as the couple that was getting married was, in his sense as an artist, as he considered himself, to be an endorsement of that form of marriage, which he didn't consider to be marriage, and therefore objected to being asked to make the cake. And the counter argument from the couple was that this was discrimination against them because of their homosexuality, and that this person would be required, ought to be required by law, compelled by law, to make a cake for their wedding, because otherwise they were being discriminated against.
Dan, thank you. Look, I remember that much of it, but there was some very careful analysis, which I don't have at hand and I've managed to forget, about what in specific terms was the cake maker's objection. So we need clarity on that one. And I'm sorry, I just don't know it. But there are other things to say, and they come up with respect to the provision of VAD, voluntary assisted dying, as it's called, voluntary assisted suicide, and other procedures. And that is, it makes a difference if he was the only cake maker. He was the only person who could have provided this cake. And I gather that he wasn't. Just as in various countries there are debates about Catholic adoption agencies not being prepared to facilitate adoptions to same-sex couples. It makes a difference if it's the only adoption agency in the vicinity, in the town, in the city. But I'm sorry to say I just don't have that on hand, but I think the specifics of the case are important.
Yes, you're probably right. I don't remember them either. I think it was settled on grounds other than the ethical question that we've been using to illustrate it with. It was on some legal technicality that I can't recall at the moment, rather than the substantive moral question that we're raising.
I have it written here somewhere,
Yeah.
but
Oh my. So I wish I could simply unmute people and they could ask these difficult questions themselves. I wonder if you might talk a little bit more directly about healthcare issues. So, we tried to talk a little bit there about the wedding cake, but didn't make it all that far. Where does, use the American expression, push come to shove here, in particular in the healthcare setting? So, why is your way of parsing out religious freedom, Bernadette, so important when it comes to a particular question in healthcare ethics?
well, let me give two examples. One goes just to cosmetic surgery, and one goes to the specifics of gender-affirming surgery. I mention them both because I'd like her to forget the second one. The first one is this, that in Australia we have some great Catholic public hospitals, and so far they are greatly loved and cherished by the Australian population. But there's always the claim made that because they don't provide the full range of legally available services, they shouldn't be receiving public funds. So that view is kind of hostile to Catholic public hospitals. But an important thing is that the people who work in Catholic public hospitals represent the same range of beliefs as the rest of society. So here's an example. Cosmetic surgery for young women is enormously lucrative. Our code of ethics says that we should resist going along with the excessive emphasis put on physical appearance. So there's something that is socially and culturally worth preserving. Who's our greatest difficulty? The cosmetic surgeons. who want to be free to provide this enormously lucrative form of business. Now, of course, there is an argument that if you're doing surgery for cancer, you need to be able to do reconstructive surgery. There's an argument, but it doesn't justify all the provision of cosmetic surgery that in fact goes on. So there's an example of a way of thinking about human beings that's worth preserving, that not everything, that physical appearance is not the number one thing that matters. So there's one thing that really matters. Now, you might say, well, there's nothing distinctive about that. That's true. But I don't know of any other system of healthcare providers in Australia which is still trying to hold on to that way of thinking against internal pressures as well as external pressures. And the gender affirming surgery, that's we're going to face that. We already face it in private hospitals, and so far at least, we're able to speak to the people involved, the surgeons involved, and remind them of what it was that they said they accepted when they sought operating rights at the Catholic hospital. But it'll be put under pressure. And so far, at least, so far as I know, that form of surgery isn't available in public hospitals. We have a great public healthcare system here, but it will come.
This may be our last question, and I apologize. There are many more questions than I'm able to pose here, but what are the limits to toleration, if that's the appropriate word, of objections of conscience, again, if that's the appropriate terminology, to within a healthcare system or elsewhere? Again, focus on healthcare. I think that might help us. So you referred to, I think you put it, gender affirming surgery. So there are some questions here about LGBTQ people and whether discrimination against these people finally ought to be tolerated by Catholic organizations or what have you. So how far does it go? And Dan, I suppose that's a question too about the logic that you analyzed. Yes, you can plug in different variables. It might be the same logic, but nonetheless, there might be a limit in what we would take to be tolerable. So how far are you willing to push your argument? I mean, that'd be another way to put it, though I recognize not very precise.
Dan, do you want to keep up?
Yeah, maybe I can start on that. I think that we can sort of go back to the swastika example if you want. That one of the limits ought to be that there should be no tolerance for intolerance, right? So if the belief that is being espoused by the institution is we will not treat people who are transgender for whatever is wrong with them, cancer or diabetes, then that is intolerant, right? That is not saying that the fact that they have cancer or diabetes is not something that violates the belief of the institution. You are being intolerant toward the person. So there should be, that's one limit. And the other, I might go a little further than Bernadette, and maybe in the outback you've got the hospital where there's nobody else available. But I think that at least in the United States, people have been hard pressed to find any cases in which there's not some alternative. It might be inconvenience, but inconvenience ought to be a price that we're willing to pay for tolerance of differing beliefs, religious or not. The other limit I would see would be for the state to step in. If there's a direct, serious and likely threat of grave harm to someone, then I think that there would be an opportunity for the state to move in and say, that far you can't go. I sort of take the position, and I've published on this, that's more that the question isn't really about conscientious objection, which is really a very specialized legal term for things like military service or the swearing of oaths in courts, where there are exemptions carved out. That this is really mostly about our ability to be tolerant, to tolerate not only a diversity of identities, but a diversity of beliefs, a diversity of ideas, a diversity of institutions. I take a kind of Lockean perspective on this, because that's where our ideas of tolerance actually in the Western world come from, and they've been very helpful to our general ability to tolerate each other in pluralistic liberal democracies for quite a few hundred years now. That there are limits, but those limits, as he put it, were treason or regicide. so there, it's a pretty high bar for not tolerating certain kinds of practices that are held to be, deeply religious beliefs. And so I think that intolerance would be self-defeating. That would be one limit, and the other would be, a serious, direct threat of imminent harm to, an identifiable party.
Bernard, look, I think all I've got to say at this stage is that then the argument would move to the significance of the harm, because then the idea is raised that there are so-called status harms, that it harms me, that I know that there are hospitals that won't provide the service that I seek, even though I can get it from there.
Right.
Merely knowing that harms me.
Yeah.
Now, I'm sure Dan can reply to that, but I mention that just because I go back to the very end of what I had to say, that we're always in the middle of this discussion. There's always something more to say. There are very few knockdown arguments.
Thank you very much. Yes, there is more to say about those status harms, or so-called dignitary harms, right? Since here I'm thinking certainly a lot of arguments that we heard in the civil rights era in this country would be relevant then to this debate. You can think about a gay couple, baker refuses to make the cake. You can also think about a black couple, baker refuses to make a cake. And I think there's a case to be made that that's a very serious harm. And then, as you say, we're in the middle of things. We'd have to try to distinguish the two cases if they can be distinguished significantly. All right, friends. Thank you very much. Thank you to our speakers. Thank you for all the questions. I think I maybe was able to pose, I don't know, maybe a tenth or so of the questions, including some more challenging questions that I didn't quite, I wasn't quite able to make it into the mix. But thank you for that, I think quite complex and subtle presentation. Thanks, Dan, for your response, and thanks to everybody for sticking with us to the end. Have a good night.